This statue, its dedication, and 3 memorial stones are all that remain to commemorate the 7 years when the Bank of England turned the Ballroom at Trentham Gardens into the central clearinghouse for millions of cheques vital to the war effort between 1939 and 1946. The Ballroom had been built in 1931 to extend the appeal of the established gardens. Originally called the Entertainment Hall, it had a dance floor of polished maple wood which was one of the largest in the UK, and the interior was lavishly decorated with gold and bronze cellulosed lacquer work. So successful was this venture that, over the winter of 1938, improvements were made to the ballroom to accommodate greater numbers of dancers. Enclosed balconies surrounding the ballroom were added, and by 1939 dances were taking place each weekend with a resident band led by Norman Jones, as well as visiting bands such as the famous Victor Sylvester Ballroom Orchestra. Throughout the 1930s, Trentham Gardens, with its ballroom, lake, gardens and Art Deco swimming pool, had established itself as a popular playground and rendezvous for the Potteries and the Midlands. But throughout this decade there also were rumblings of war. Local historian Graham Bebbington takes up the story.
Really, one has to go back to 1931, when the government, in its wisdom, quite rightly, was starting to make preparations for war, knowing what was going on in Nazi Germany at the time. And it had done things like inviting tenders for a new fighter aircraft, which resulted in Mitchell's Spitfire eventually. But also, surprisingly at that time, it started to prepare evacuation plans that even then provided for the evacuation of children, women and babies. But as time went on, around about 1938, they decided that it had got to be reappraised, the whole scheme, and that provided for the evacuation of government departments, including the Bank of England and its clearing bank. The reasoning behind this was that aerial warfare had advanced so much since the First World War, and the powers that be realised that after the bombings in Spain, that if you command the skies and have bombers, then you could soon win the situation. The Imperial Defence Committee decided that something must be done, that the capital would be most likely hit or even wiped out, and so you prepare for this mass evacuation. And that's how the clearing banks came to be at Trentham. The banks set up a working party in 1938. They examined various sites, including Trentham. They had to fall into what was termed safe or neutral area. Now, these were secret lists drawn up by the government. Amazing really, Staffordshire features on the list. No one seems to know exactly what constitutes a safe or neutral area, because if they'd have looked back to the First World War, they'd have found out that Staffordshire was one of the few areas outside London which in fact had been bombed by Zeppelin in 1916. The postal and railway authorities had to be able to service the site, including the handling of at least 7,000 items of correspondence a day. And of course, in the case of Trentham, the railway station was just across the way, and the postal authorities undertook their part, and that's briefly how they came to be at Trentham. The clearing banks are the nerve centre of clearing cheques to and from various parts of the country, and in 1938 a daily run was 1 million cheques even then, and that was estimated at £130 million. The actual moving of personnel from London took place in 1939. First of all, the equipment came up by road convoys, and 1,000 personnel came in by 2 special trains on the 26th of August 1939. The actual place was fully operational a few days later when war was declared. It was actually a masterpiece of organisation and forward planning.
Background planning must have been taking place through the Committee of Clearing Bankers, because on Friday the 25th of August 1939, a memo from Mr. Percival Quick, a high-ranking official of Barclays Bank, who became the first comptroller of the Central Clearing House, clarified arrangements for the transfer of personnel and equipment to Trentham.
Dear Sirs, I have been in touch with the LMS Railway, and the earliest times that I can arrange for the two special trains from Broad Street on the 26th instant for the personnel are 9 p.m, arriving at Trentham Park at 12:20 a.m. Sunday, 9:55 p.m, arriving at Trentham Park at 1:15 a.m. Sunday. It was necessary to settle this definitely, and I have done so. Will you please note that the railway will start picking up the borough's adding machines from the clearing house at 1 p.m, so that it is necessary for those banks which are sending additional machines to see that they reach the clearing house by that time. As regards the record DACs, the railway and the representatives of Kodak Limited will be picking these up from the various banks starting from 1 p.m, and they will be transported to Trentham by goods train the same night.
Also on the 25th of August, Mr. F. Goodall, the Deputy Principal of the Bill Office at the Bank of England, sent a terse memo to employees with strict instructions to report to the bank on the following day, bringing their sandwiches, one suitcase and one attaché case for the move to Trentham Gardens. The same day, in Stoke-on-Trent, the Sentinel announced that from the 26th of August the ballroom would be closed until further notice, but the gardens and amusements and the swimming pool and cafe would remain open. On Saturday, the 26th of August, two special trains left from Broad Street Station in London, arriving in the early hours of Sunday the 27th. One of those travelling from London that night takes up the story.
It was a nightmarish feeling when we first pulled up at Trentham. Naturally, we wanted to get out, when a voice from the outer darkness cried, "Keep your seats, please." We all hung out of the windows, straining our eyes and looking into the blackness. There was no sign of habitation or indication of life, apart from some dim lanterns and muffled voices. After more lamp waving, our engine was unhitched from the front and hitched on again at the back, and we started off down a branch line. After a couple of minutes, we stopped again at a tiny station, which we learned later was Trentham Park, where what appeared to be about 100 buses were lined up. We bundled into the buses, men in some and women in others, and we bowled along in the pitch dark until the bus stopped, and the evacuation officer for that bus got out and knocked on the door, and after some minutes returned. "Nothing doing there." Apparently, the lady of the house, perhaps disgruntled at being knocked up at that unearthly hour on a Sunday morning, had changed her mind and refused to take anybody in. This was not cheering news, but at the next stop, one of us was asked to get out, and then two, then another one, and so on. As there were 35 of us on the bus, you can imagine that it was well into the early hours before the last of us found a place to lay his or her weary head.
Hey, you two bring us away for a talking there. You know, Gladys, we aren't very posh, so you'd have to take us to find us.
And these are my sisters, Mabel.
Hello.
And Ada.
Pleased to meet you.
Make yourself comfortable.
I bet you're homely after your journey, aren't
Come
you?
over, Tom, and let us sit by you.
Don't mind the poor girl, Mother.
And this is Aunt Florrie, Gladys, Bert's sister.
Pleased to meet you, Gladys.
You here, get that down, you.
We would like to express a debt of gratitude to the inhabitants of the Potteries and Newcastle for the more than friendly way they have welcomed us into their homes and done everything possible to make our exile happy and comfortable.
Another bank employee, Mr. R.B. Day, later encapsulated the experience of arrival in this area in a parody of Longfellow's poem Hiawatha.
You shall hear how up at Trentham, in the Potteries of Stafford, There arrived one night so dismal, in 2 trains all hot and smoky, teeming crowds of untamed bank clerks, male and female, all assorted, each complete with case and toothbrush, and with things here not reported. How they bunged them, stuffed them, rammed them into buses cold and cheerless, and by ways so slow and bumpy, took them for that painful night ride to the wigwams of Trent Valers, to the parts of distant Westlands, back again and round the houses, even to the heights of Longton.
On the following Sunday morning, members of bank staff set out, eager to see the place in which they were to work for the duration, which they were still optimistic to believe would not be too long. One worker recalled it like this.
On arriving at Trentham Gardens, with its large advertisements of dancing, swimming pool, miniature railway, archery and bowling greens, we walked down a road between glorious trees with a glimpse of a large lake and the River Trent, very black and oily looking. We soon came in sight of a large dance hall with innumerable French windows leading into the gardens. Numbers of bank clerks in their shirt sleeves, some in +4s, some in flannels and others in city clothes, were rushing around, putting up trestle tables, dumping adding machines here and recordac machines there. Everybody getting in everybody else's way, in a state of absolute chaos.
But it was a planned chaos, as another member of staff recorded later in the staff magazine.
Before the banking hordes descended, a great deal of unobtrusive work had previously been taking place in Trentham. So when the staff eventually arrived, a small advance guard was already in action, and during the course of the Saturday, an army of workmen were busy digging out of the stables of the former Trentham Hall the various stores accumulated during the preceding 6 months. Work continued on the Sunday, and thanks to previous planning, furniture, machines and recordacs were rapidly placed in the required positions. All this went on under the admiring gaze of numerous members of the public. A minor problem was to prevent them from wandering round the hall and playing with the machines. One local resident remarked he would never have believed that Trentham Ballroom could have been converted into a bank in 24 hours.
On Monday the 28th of August, a rather disgruntled Mr. Goodall wrote to his superior Mr. Arthur Hall, principal of the Bill Office at the Bank of England, about his weekend.
Dear Hall, I arrived here about 8 p.m. on Saturday with Foster, Ms. Rowe and Miss Goodge. I took the 2 girls and Foster and Woodruff to the Trentham Hotel for a meal. Later, I took the 2 girls to the North Stafford Hotel for the night. The maximum accommodation at the North Stafford is 91, which will not allow for all my staff. So whilst Pyle and I were out billeting yesterday, the girls, Woodruff and the men had got everything ready in our permanent quarters in the old kitchen of the ballroom. I heard all the other banks gave their staff £5 each to pay for the first 2 weeks' billeting and cover incidental expenses. It is now 6 p.m. on Monday and we are far from finishing. I am not at all sure we have enough recordacs, as we may have to do more than anticipated. Yours sincerely, F. Goodall.
All the banks had their clearing departments centralised at the gardens, particularly in the ballroom and the gallery around. And I was going to be allocated to Lloyd's Bank Limited, and I was to go upstairs where they were in the gallery. Off I went up there thinking, this is not a bank, you know, this is Trentham Gardens, this is Trentham Gardens Ballroom. Too young to actually have been in there to dance, obviously, but that was it. And the routine of the day was you had your position at a desk which was coverable by a folding top, and cheques would come in by the bagful and just be poured onto the top in front of you, and what you did is you sorted them into various. Now there were various kinds of sorting. The initial sorting from the bags that came in from the Royal Mail was actually sorting out which bank the cheque referred to. And everybody around in Trentham Gardens was actually doing that. They were sorting the cheques that had come into their branches, sorting them into Lloyd's, National, Provincial. And of course, there were lots more banks in those days, Williams, Deacons, Martins, people like that. So we sorted all those out, and then the bundles of the cheques for the particular banks were then delivered to that particular bank section.
Another local bank worker to record her memories was Estelle Skinner, née Davies.
I was 17 when the war started, working at the Stoke branch of Barclays Bank and living in Trent Vale on Ronson Avenue, but was quickly drafted to work at Trentham. I usually walked to and from work. It took about half an hour each way, but it was better than waiting for a bus in the cold, and saved on the bus fare too. The buses were often full with other workers, and I was also worried about missing my stop in the blackout. There were no street signs, lights or shop signs to give a clue where you were, and the bus just had a little blue light on inside. Our work involved sorting cheques to be returned to the various banks they were drawn on, and lots of filing on index cards. I used an adding machine to total up the cheques and columns of figures, a big heavy one with a handle that you pulled on the side to do the totals. I used to wake my sister up in the night. We shared a bed, doing this in my sleep. All of a sudden, my right arm would pull the handle, and I usually hit her with it instead. I suppose today this would be called repetitive strain injury, and I would be entitled to compensation. We had air raid practices at work. There were shelters in the grounds, and when the sirens went, we had to first sheet up our work, then open the big French windows and go to the shelters, taking our gas masks, of course, until the all clear was sounded. The sheet we had to use was a piece of canvas or tarpaulin-like material nailed to the underside of one end of the desk. The other end was nailed to a stick around which the material was rolled. This was then hooked under the desk. When the siren went, you grabbed the roll and threw it right over the desk so that the stick hung down the other side and kept the material tight, which stopped all the papers on the desk from blowing away when the French windows were opened. If the cheques had gone everywhere, it would have taken days to sort out the mess, and they could have fallen into enemy hands, which was a security risk. After the war, I saw a desk in the museum in Churchill's Bunker in London with exactly the same thing on it.
When the banks first came, the manning was southerners. By the time that the Clean Bank returned to the capital, the majority of people working there were in fact locals. So it certainly helped the local economy from various aspects, really, jobs, that sort of thing, but the work that was also provided in the area. For instance, they had simple things like staff magazines, which were published every so often. Firms like Vises, the local printers, that sort of thing. It was all local business, and then they had a commemorative mug done in 1940, 12 months after they'd been here. Again, that was specially commissioned by the people at Trentham, and it was manufactured by Falconware. They'd got a marvellous social life. You could be forgiven for thinking there wasn't a war on. They got things like siren theatre, and the programmes, it said things like, in the event of an air raid warning, the performance will continue. And they were doing shows like Ivan Novello, Priestley, all these sort of things. And they didn't only do the shows there for their own personnel, they took them out into the area to entertain other people. They went to the Loggerhead Sanatorium. They did charity performances, and you can bet if there was a disaster in the area, such as when there was a colliery disaster, they did performances for that.
Honestly, there was much more than the working side, because they had been transported from their homes, from London, Glasgow, Manchester, people from the big cities to Trentham, and consequently they had no society. They hadn't any homes, of course, to begin with. So they'd found somewhere to live or let to rent, and they also then had to found their own sort of societies, which would include the dramatic society, a choir, those sort of things. And of course, this was all new to me, and because most of the men of a particular age had already gone into the forces at 18, there were lots of major parts going in the drama society. And anybody who looked a little bit older than their norm, 15 or 16, got the parts. I remember having a really big part in one of the plays. And the people who actually directed the plays became very, very famous. And Nancy Hines, I think, who was one of our directors, became quite a big wheel in Seamer, as did another of the directors. But the late Christopher Bean marked my dramatic performance, and in Act 2 I think I had to go and kiss the heroine, you see, and I was finding that very difficult. I mean, I was, you know, a young man who wasn't used to this sort of stuff. And I remember Nancy saying to me, "Oh, Nora," to the girl, "oh, Nora, for God's sake, take him into the woods." And off we went and did some practicing, which I thought was quite nice, actually. And so that was that. And then there were always smoking concerts that they held in what was the sort of bar, I think. I don't know what it became later on, because I never went there afterwards, strangely enough. But there would be smoking contests, and there'd be fun and jokes and comedians and things like that. So that was another side of things. And also, Alfred Pinnington had come up from London. He had been a member of the Royal Choral Society, quite a senior member. And at that particular time, the Ceramic City Choir had been formed in Stoke. And he was prevailed upon to actually come and do things and conduct and rehearse the choir. And as a result of that, of course, his conductor at the Royal Choral Society, Malcolm Sargent, came up to the Potteries to take over Ceramic City Choir concerts. So that was a wonderful bonus for the area, really. So as you can see, apart from doing the work, apart from looking after the premises, because we all had to take turns in fire watching and manning the fire pump, practicing by, if you've never held a hose pipe with great pressured water coming out of it, believe you me, it's quite an experience. And we'd wander down into the trench where, with the little trailer, and we'd set up and, you know, pretend to be firemen. And at night, when we were staying on the premises because of fire watching, we'd walk around in the roof of the ballroom, and of course it was beyond the roof, because that was a sort of type of mouldings which made the roof, and between all the various half domes of the roof there was a walkway, and so we had to go right up there to make sure there were no incendiary bombs and things like that. So you can see immediately too I got an extra cultural activities for pretty well every day I was there, and secondly I was also meeting adults in quantity who had an effect, you know, obviously on the way that I lived. So consequently I can only look back on it all by saying that it really made my life at that particular time.
And quite a number of ladies who I got to know later, mainly through their husbands, arrived here as young lady clerks, working in the ballroom, at the desks in the ballroom, in conjunction with the Bank of England, and several of them, after the war was over, married and remained in this area.
So there's all that going on at Trentham during the war. A lot of it's still not appreciated, but it's got to be emphasised that Trentham's contribution to the Allied effort shouldn't be underestimated at all.
The war ended in Europe in May 1945. But the operations of the Central Clearing House continued in Trentham Ballroom until 1946, although they did start winding down. On Monday the 29th of April 1946, a farewell dance for the local temporary staff of the Central Clearing House was held in the King's Hall, Stoke. The dance was attended by over 1,000 people, and the music was provided by Reg Bassett's band. At this event, Mr. Brian Bennett, the comptroller of the Central Clearing House since 1941, said,
"My greatest happiness during the past 5 years has been serving your best interests to the best of my ability, and watching the 1,000 locally recruited staff, boys, girls and women, become welded into a happy and efficient unit. It is with real sorrow that I must say goodbye to you all. I do hope that you've all learned and received something in Trentham which you will remember in the days to come, and that your stay in the Potteries has been a happy one."
Another farewell dance was held on Tuesday the 16th of July 1946, when members of the Clearinghouse staff held a private function with the ballroom returned to its original purpose for one night, and the music was again provided by Reg Bassett and his band. About 600 members of the clearinghouse staff, with a similar number of their friends, attended the event for which the long-disused lighting effects and loudspeaker relay were brought into operation. The majority of the staff were leaving the following Saturday, but the clearinghouse didn't completely vacate the building until the end of August. It was expected to be available for public dancing again around Christmas, as extensive alterations and repairs were needed. Here are the vital statistics for the 7 years that the Central Clearinghouse occupied the ballroom from August 1939 to August 1946. 11 banks were represented, as well as the Bank of England. An average daily receipt of 7,000 envelopes containing cheques came by train to be cleared and dispatched the same day. Over 1 billion cheques passed through the Recordac microfilm machines during that 7 years at Trentham. In 1939, there were 955 bank staff, 363 men and 592 women. By 1945, there were still 898 bank staff, but only 170 were men and 728 women. In 1939, only 123 of the staff were local. By 1945, the number of locals employed was 619. Trentham Gardens were paid an annual rent for the ballroom of £3,500, which, over the 7 years, would have totalled almost £25,000. There can be no doubt that the operation of the Central Clearinghouse at Trentham successfully stood the test for the duration of war. There still remain memories and reminders of this episode in local and national history, including some clear childhood memories from former Trentham resident Sybil Austin.
I was almost 10 years old when the war broke out. When the clearing banks came to Trentham, a bank employee called Cyril Munden was billeted with us on Stone Road. I remember the policeman arriving with him in the middle of the night and my mother agreeing to squeeze him in, although there were 5 of us already. The best bit for me was his sons coming here during the school holidays. Later, he bought a house nearby and lived there with his family all through the war. Mr. Munden told us it was safer for his family to be here with him rather than living down in London. I liked having them here, and I became good friends with the Munden boys. The Mundens became part of our community. In 1946, the banks left, and the Mundens returned to London. But we kept in touch for many years. They were happy memories.
Bank staff also recognised the hospitality shown to them by the various societies and clubs they joined locally. In 1946, they gave a Central Clearinghouse trophy to Trentham Park Golf Club as a token appreciation from the outcasts who had joined its ranks. The trophy is still presented each year. 3 memorial stones in the gardens recognise the war service of men related to the banks. Sergeant James Tranter was killed in June 1942. Sergeant John Naunton died in 1944. Donald Aubrey Chatham also died in 1944. He was the son of Robert Felton Chatham, who was Chief Inspector for the Clearinghouse for the duration of the war. His name is also inscribed on Trentham War Memorial. The distinctive commemorative 7-sided statue, designed by Robert Berkoff, located in the Italian Garden, was presented by the Committee of London Clearing Bankers and erected on the 24th of February 1976. The ballroom reopened to great jubilation on the 7th of April 1947. Many visitors to the gardens and garden centre these days may have little idea that on that same site a famous ballroom stood for 51 years, and for 7 of those years it contained a very important bank.